So we're in the middle of a GVG here. I'm only one person, but that's good enough to give these players some content. And I'm role-playing as a raid boss for them because we're lacking in content in terms of raids, and it's going to take a full raid to take me out. And as you can see, my raid mechanics are that I'm a bit slippery. And I'm going to go back in for the stealth stomp. Yeah, bet they didn't see that one coming, literally. But I'm a little bit low on cooldowns because of that, so that'll thicken the plot. But obviously, a plot that's very intricate is very important to a good raid encounter. So I'll be juking around here and trying to deny them the kill because I can't just be free loot. So I'm going to juke around here on this veteran Oakheart with that dark path and use my flesh worm to get out of there. Now, they're very thirsty for the kill, and they've even got a cannoneer on me. So I'm going to really have to survive using my spectral walk, and I think I'm free now. They don't know. They have no idea. I'm free. Good GVG. Yes, this is called the Raid Boss Necromancer. This is a world versus world roaming build that's designed to allow you to feel like you're immortal. That is, until a full guild comes up to you and puts every inch of their DPS into you. Roaming as a necromancer is kind of been difficult lately and throughout history because it doesn't really have hard mitigation. So for example, if you fight 5 players, 1v5, and you're a thief, if you evade and all 5 of those players attack into your evade, you take no damage. The same as if you take no damage from one player. So in that way, evasion scales up very well. It's good in scaling up. But Necromancer doesn't really scale up that well because if you're fighting one player, yes, it feels very tanky to fight as a Necromancer. But if you're fighting 5 players as one player, they all just do the same amount of damage, and your health bar has a finite amount. It's not a hard mitigation. So you'll struggle to survive outnumbered situations as a Necromancer. So I designed this build around being as tanky as possible so that even though, yes, it will scale up very hard on you when you go 1v20, you can still sort of survive really massive outnumbered situations like 1v5s. And also, you're just going to have a lot of trouble surviving in general when you just get CC'd all the time. So I put in a lot of survivability through just pure juking the enemy with the worm and spectral walk. And also, this is not just a build, but a race combination. You must use the Snow Leopard Elite from the Norn Racial. So we'll talk about that later as well. But basically, you just stay in Shroud as long as possible, and Shroud actually has a damage reduction modifier on it naturally. So being in Shroud makes you very resistant to power damage. You gain a lot of Condi Cleanse and sustain from the just being in Shroud, and you get longer Shrouds and more sustain from the Unholy Sanctuary and the Signet Mastery trait. And then you also have a decent amount of damage because of Dread and the Celerity Sigil, which gives you quickness, quite a large uptime of it too, which allows you to spam through your rotation as quickly as possible and then return back into your Shroud so that you can become a tanky, meaty unit. And you've also got a lot of burn from the Doomfire trait. So, you're role-playing as a raid boss, so why not use the trait that refers to one of the most iconic raid bosses? So let's get into the build a little bit more in depth. So Death Magic, you're going to have a Carapace mechanic. Whenever you gain a stack of Carapace, you gain 20 toughness. So you'll gain Carapace for 10 seconds, and you gain it 5 stacks whenever you enter Shroud. Not going to happen too often because you're usually staying in Shroud, but it's kind of nice. And you also have shrouded removal, which is every 3 seconds while in shroud, you will lose a condition. And you'll also gain 3 carapace every time you lose a condition. So, and that's just not with only that traits removal. It's any kind of Condi cleanse will give you carapace. So that is really good with the rune of antitoxin. So whenever you remove a condition, you'll remove another condition. So you remove 2 conditions from this trait, which means 6 carapace, which is 120 toughness every 3 seconds, and then obviously it'll run out after 10 seconds. But it just gives you a lot of condition counter and a lot of power counter to be in Shroud. So you're just really tanky. Then you also have Dark Defiance, not too important because you don't really have a lot of protection uptime, so you're not really getting the condition damage reduction very often, but it's better than the rest of the traits you could take because it's not really a power build anyways. It's more of a Condi build. So yeah, it's not really that important. And while you're above 10 stacks of carapace, you gain 10% condition damage reduction, which is kind of nice because you're going to pretty much always be above 10 carapace. It's very easy, right? Because every 3 seconds you're gaining basically 6 from Shrouded removal. So yeah, it's pretty easy to keep it up over 10. And that adds more to your survivability. And Unholy Sanctuary gives you 1% of your maximum health healed while in Shroud. So this is really important because the build doesn't really have a massive heal skill. So you're using the Signet heal. So you kind of gain healing over time. So it's nice that Unholy Sanctuary kind of supplements your healing. And it also has a sort of like a life insurance kind of effect to it. So whenever you die, you will go into Shroud if you have enough Shroud to go into it, which is 10%, and it'll basically prevent you from getting killed because there's a 10-second window between leaving Shroud and entering it, in which you're very vulnerable because you're not getting that damage reduction, you're not getting the Condi cleanse, so you're very vulnerable when you leave Shroud. You have some ways to kind of survive during that, but still that is when people are going to be trying to burst you down. So if you do get bursted down, it'll put you back into Shroud, and there's a 30-second ICD on that. So really, people just need to kill you through your Shroud every single time, which makes it so that, yeah, you end up having as much effective health as you think you do. There's no like counterplay of just save your burst until they leave Shroud and then kill them before that 10 seconds cooldown comes up. So yeah, Unholy Sanctuary makes this into a real raid boss because your raid mechanic of Unholy Sanctuary basically allows you a phase 2. And then Spite is pretty important because whenever you use your Shroud 1, which you're using a lot, you'll gain Might, which gives you condition damage, which is nice because you need as many modifiers as you can to sort of get your damage up there because you don't really have many traits that give you damage. Then you'll just give vulnerability whenever you chill, not too important, but you do have a lot of chills on this build, and that's just more damage modifiers. You also give some vulnerability to low targets. Now Signet Mastery, or Signets of Suffering, is the important trait here. So whenever you go into Shroud, your signets gain an additional effect. So I'm using 2 signets, Signet of Vampirism and Signet of Undeath. And also while in Shroud, your signets, the active effects, gain a recharge of 4 seconds or 4% per second. So I'm going to use my heal signet here, and then I'm going to go into Shroud. And then as you can see, my signets are still giving me the passive effects while in Shroud because of the Signets of Suffering. And then I've been here maybe like 10 seconds, I'm going to leave, and my heal skill is already off cooldown. So it allows you to spam your heal very often and get value out of the active effects without losing the passives, because the passives not only are active while in Shroud, So as soon as you use the active, you want to go into Shroud and keep maintaining that passive, but also getting the active back. And the extra effect of Signet of Suffering for the heal skill is that, well, first of all, Signet of Vampirism puts a debuff on the target, and you can hit that target to gain lifesteal, and your allies can do that too. But the passive is that while you have to be really close to the enemy to do this. While you're close to the enemy, you will life siphon health from them, and this is really good because it's active while in your Shroud, so you can sort of like use your heal skill while in Shroud. And that's the reason that's good is because you're going to be in Shroud very often, and you can't really get the maximum use out of your heal skill usually. And just being in Shroud gives you that value. But it's only one target when you're out of Shroud. When you're in Shroud, it's 2 targets. So when you're being outnumbered, you actually gain more sustain, and it allows you to scale up and fight those outnumbered situations better. So yeah, that's really good. And for Signet of Undeath, we'll go over the active effect a little bit, but basically the passive gives you life force over time. And that's really important because it's also active while in Shroud. So in a way, it allows you to maintain your Shroud longer because, first of all, it gives you more Shroud, so you just have a longer duration of being in Shroud because it's a higher value. But while you're in Shroud, it's also ticking. So as you can see there, I'm not really doing anything, but it's still going up a little bit sometimes, and then going back down a little bit more, but still going up sometimes. So in Shroud, the life force gain is actually 33% more than when you're out of Shroud. So just being in Shroud gives you a lot of value on this build. And obviously the active effect is really strong too. So yeah. Let's, the utility here isn't right, but we'll talk about the utilities later. So yeah, that's really good. You also gain a little bit more might when the enemy is below 50% HP, which isn't really that important, but dread is really important. So whenever you fear a foe, you gain 5 seconds of quickness and 10 seconds of fury. Fury isn't really that important, but the quickness of 5 seconds is really long for a 3-second ICD. So you have 3, or is it? Yeah, it's 2 sources of fear on this build. So you have Reaper's Mark, and you have the Shroud 3 skill, and that basically means that you can get 10 seconds of quickness in succession, and as long as you don't use them within 3 seconds of each other. And it's just really good for keeping your skill rotation flowing very quickly so that you don't get interrupted or you just deal damage. And it also allows you to spam your 1 skill in Shroud, because your 1 skill is an auto attack that gives burning because of Doomfire. And Doomfire is good because, first of all, this is a Condi build, but also because this is a raid boss roleplay, and why not use a trait that refers to one of the most iconic raid bosses, Doom? So in Soul Reaping, I also go for Speed of Shadows. Speed of Shadows is nice because it removes conditions when you enter Shroud, which you're not really getting that value too often because you're staying in Shroud. But whenever you remove conditions, you remove an extra one because of antitoxin runes, as I said. And that can be pretty good because when you go into Shroud, you also remove a condition. So you'd remove like 4 conditions there, unless you remove like 3 from here, and then it'd do 4 here and then 2 there. So a maximum of 6 conditions removed on entering Shroud. But in general, the swiftness uptime is pretty good because when you're getting focused, you're often getting your boons stripped. So just as many swiftness applications as you can is important for maintaining your mobility and your survivability. Also, you could take soul marks because this is a staff build and unblockable marks is very good. And the life force generation is super good because that gives you more sustain, more just shroud in general is just really good for the build. So, and often you're going to be using all your staff skills as soon as you leave shroud to try to get back into your shroud. And it just kind of works out that way that it's really good. However, I like Speed of Shadows because, first of all, Immobilize is one of the biggest killers of this build. If you get Immobilized, you're pretty much dead. So I like to have Immobilize removal on entering Shroud. But often you can get Immobilized after you enter Shroud. So it's kind of give and take. But either one of those traits is good. You also get a 15% reduction on your Shroud skill, which is super important because you're in Shroud most of the time. So having those skills available to you as much as possible is good. And then you also have Fear of Death, which increases the duration of your fears by 50%. You'll also have 50%-ish duration from your Trailblazers gear. So you have 100% fear duration almost, which makes your fears last very long and allows you to defensively and offensively single target players. So obviously fear is defensive in that it pushes them away from you, and it's also offensive in that it allows you to proc dread, which gives you quickness, and while they're feared you can be spamming your auto attack with Doomfire on them. So it also, you'll get maximum life force increase, which is super important for this build, right? Because more Shroud is more sustain, is more everything. So yeah, those are the traits. Let's go over the equipment now. So I have full Trailblazers. I have a couple of Vipers pieces here and there, but you should go full Trailblazers because that gives you the toughness and vitality, which is super important to this build. You could go for like healing power or like a Wanderers, or what is it? Is it Wanderers? The one that gives you power and toughness, healing power, and boon duration. And then maybe go for like a Corruptor's Fervor build. But it just ends up that if you're using like Death Perception instead of Doomfire, you're actually just doing less damage because condition builds only require 2 stats really. I mean, you could use Precision with Curses to get more, but this isn't using Curses. So you get pretty much as much damage as you could want from stats from Trailblazers, and that's just really good because you're really tanky with toughness and vitality. And actually the more vitality that you get, the more sustain that you get because of Unholy Sanctuary, because it heals you for a percentage of your max health. So healing power really wouldn't be that good as vitality would be, because vitality gives you tankiness because more Shroud is more everything, and then just in general more healing. So yeah, I take vitality infusions as well, just for as much health as I can get. And yeah, that's pretty much the stats. Just go full Trailblazer. And also expertise is really important because the added condition duration not only affects damaging conditions, but also, as I said, fear durations, and also like chill duration and weakness duration. So it makes debilitating conditions last longer, which is really important. So I take the Antitoxin rune as well, which gives you more condition damage, which is important because you want to be getting your condition damage as high as you can while also being super tanky. So the build relies on a lot of efficiency and stats, right? Because you're not getting hard mitigation with this build. You're just trying to purely out-stat people. And yeah, so Antitoxin gives you the condition damage, and it gives you minus condition duration, which isn't that important because you have a lot of cleanse from the Shrouded Removal trait, but you are going to get a lot of conditions on you that you're not going to be able to cleanse if you're outnumbered. So it is somewhat useful, but what is most useful about this is the condition cleanse that it gives you on top of your cleanse. So whenever you cleanse condition, antitoxin adds another on top. And it's how it works is it counts the condition cleanse per skill. So if you have a skill that cleanses 4 conditions, antitoxin will cleanse 5. Well, it'll cleanse a 5th condition. So it doesn't cleanse 1 per 1, it does 1 per skill. So it's really good basically with things that do small amounts of conditions but lots of pulses of them. So it's perfect for shrouded removal and spectral walk. Also, I take on my staff energy celerity. Energy is really good for necromancers because it is hard mitigation, right? A dodge is just, if 5 people hit you while you're dodging, 5 people miss. So yeah, even though you're trying to spec into the tankiness of the build, yeah, you do want the evasiveness as well because they'll supplement each other. Celerity is you gain quickness for 5 seconds after disabling a foe. Fear counts as a disable, so in conjunction with Dread, you can gain 10 seconds of quickness, which is pretty strong because yeah, you can just be sitting there putting burns on an enemy and it stacks up to 5 there, and you can see the burn is ticking for 2k. So quickness is pretty good for this build because it allows you to feel like you actually deal damage, even though most of the build is oriented around survivability. So yeah, it's a really good sigil in my opinion because you're not really scaling up. Like say if you're running like a force sigil with the power build, right? You'd have to, like, the more damage you have in the build, the more force sigil gets you value. And obviously it's the same thing with celerity, but it feels to me like it enables more damage from this build than a force sigil would, or like a condition sigil would, right? So it's really important. And if you look at the Scepter focus as well, so on Scepter focus I have 2 swap sigils. So whenever I swap in, I get a Geomancy sigil and a Doom sigil. So how those work is whenever you swap in, you'll do an AoE around you, and that'll do 3 bleeds. And then also on your next attack, you'll give 3 stacks of poison for 8 seconds. So, and this will proc on Shroud as well. But as you can see, I'll swap, and it'll give 3 poison and 3 bleeding to the target, which is actually a lot of damage over time if they don't cleanse it, because the durations are really long because Trailblazer. So this is really important for Necro because as I showed, whenever you enter into Shroud, you proc those sigils. So, and also when you swap, obviously. So often what you'll do is a rotation, sort of like, so you'll start in staff, right? You have 1 swap sigil on your staff. So usually you want to start in staff, and you'll get your celerity proc by just fearing the target, and that'll give you quickness. And then you just rotate through your staff skills, then you get in melee range, you swap, and then that'll do the Doom Geo, and then you can you probably still have your quickness at this point because it's 10 seconds. Then you just rotate through all of your swap there, and then you'll probably go into your Shroud before you get the ICD off, right? Because it's a 9-second ICD on the swap sigils. But by the time you leave Shroud, so this is mainly good for in the middle of a fight, when you leave Shroud, they'll also proc, and then you can immediately swap after using those skills and get your swap sigil from your staff. So it's kind of like you get 3 procs of swap sigils in a row because of how you use it with Shroud. And then if you stay in long enough, you can get another energy proc, but it's really not that important to get that. And then you probably want to swap back in and then go into Shroud, just to get as much, maximize those swap procs basically as much as you can. And yeah, it just, the fact that you have Doom Geo on your Scepter gives you so much more damage and counter pressure, because first of all, you're going to be getting attacked by people a lot. So not always are you going to be actually hitting back. So the fact that you have just whenever you're swapping your weapon, you're counter pressuring people is really good. But also, it's just really good for cleaving down bodies. And that's one thing that this build kind of lacks a little bit is down cleave. I really like the Doom Geo, but obviously you could try other stuff if you really wanted to. But my playstyle likes to kind of be in melee range with this build more often because the Signet of Vampirism requires you to be a little bit closer to the target. So yeah, that's pretty much the equipment and the sigils and stuff. The food. So the food is really important as well because, as I said, this is a build that tries to outstat the opponent. So I use full-on try-hard ascended food with the peppercorn and veggie flatbreads. So it has minus 10% damage incoming, which is important because you're just tankier. And then it also gives you expertise and condition damage, which gives you more damage. So I also use the tuning icicles, which will just give you a little bit more damage from your conditions as well. So yeah, that's pretty much to make you feel like you're tanky while also dealing damage. You can also buy the potion of Karka toughness, which you can get from the South Sun Economist during the South Sun Shore meta event. But honestly, I prefer not to go and do that. But yeah, that would give 150 toughness, and that would be really good for the build if you want to go out and get that, but I personally don't. So you have Staff and Scepter Warhorn. The reason why I like Warhorn the most out of any of these options for the weapons, you can take a dagger offhand, you can take a focus, but dagger and focus aren't really as good in outnumbered situations as possible, and this is why. So when I use the Warhorn 5, you gain life force every tick and every opponent it hits. So what you want to do with the Warhorn is like use the Warhorn 5 right before you're about to go into Shroud, and then a bunch of people might like jump on you and you're just gaining tons of life force and just maintaining your Shroud and also stealing life, which is healing you, and it just helps you to top off your Shroud so easily. And that's really the most important thing about this build is the Shroud. So yeah, Warhorn gives you the most Shroud generation, and also the unblockable days is just really important in my opinion because first of all, it helps you in down situations to prevent people from rezzing, but the AoE of the days is super strong in outnumbered situations because you're when you leave Shroud, you want to survive 10 seconds till you can get back in Shroud, and if you AoE daze all the people chasing you, that gives you another 2 seconds basically for free to get into your Shroud. And yeah, it's just really strong. Warhorn, absolutely the offhand that I would take. And the Scepter, the auto attack is it's actually kind of good, and especially with quickness, you have really long durations on your conditions there. So it's pretty okay, but generally, if you're auto attacking with Scepter, it means you're not taking any pressure, and it doesn't really matter what you do anyways. So Grasping Dread, or Dead, is a really long duration bleed and a cripple, just kind of nice to throw out there. And Feast of Corruption is the most important skill. So how Feast of Corruption kind of works is it'll give you a single boon conversion into a condition, and it'll give you life force for each condition and torment for each condition on the target. So what you want to do is you want to swap into your Scepter after using all of your staff skills so that you have as many conditions on the target as possible. Obviously it caps out at 5 conditions, so you can give 5 torment with this skill, and it gives you a lot of life force, which is good because you want the life force with this build. And basically how you want to combo this is with the Doom Geo Sigil. So you go in with the Doom Geo Sigil and you get 2 conditions on the target, and then you can use your Scepter 3, and that will add on 2 more conditions. Obviously, if you already had poison and bleeding, it wouldn't add any more, but it would allow you to use the Scepter 3 without having no conditions on the target, right? Because you immediately put the Doom Geo on, and then you Scepter 3, you know there's going to be some condies on them. So I like the Doom Geo in conjunction with the Feast of Corruption. And your staff skills, they're pretty much self-explanatory. They're all just long-range marks. The 5 skill obviously is really important because it's a fear, and it gives you 10 seconds of quickness with Dread and Celerity. The 4 is a good Condi cleanse, and with the antitoxin, that would be 4 Condi cleanse. So it has a little bit of a power coefficient to it, but you don't have any power damage. And the 3 skill is super strong because it's a 6-second chill with all of your condition duration. So it's really strong. The 2 skill also gives regen. So if you put that on top of yourself, you can give yourself a little bit of healing, and that's really strong. The auto attack, though, gives you 4 life force per target you hit. So it's really strong at getting life force. Can't say this enough, you need life force in this build. So those are pretty much the and also the 2 skill gives bleeding, which is good too. So the auto attack in Shroud is really important because it gives you the 4 seconds of burning and the might that you really want. It also pierces. So what you want to do is you want to put the target that you want to cleave or pierce in between you and your target. So say I want to hit these 2. So I want to hit the guy in the back, or I want to target the guy in the back, and then I put the guy in the middle between us, and then I pierce them. And that's pretty much, yeah, how you want to use that skill. And the Shroud 2, super important skill. This is a long range but slow moving, unblockable kind of projectile, and you can use it very versatilely because once you start casting it, you can kind of like kite away immediately, and you can do something like this and make it not so deliberate that you're actually going to use a skill. And once it lands, it gives chill for 4.5 seconds and then bleeds for 2 stacks for 12 seconds. So it's a decent damaging skill. It also will deal AoE. So for example, I hit this guy right here and it chills and bleeds all the nearby. But also after you hit, it gives you 3 seconds to decide whether you want to port to the target. And if you do port to the target, the skill goes on a longer cooldown, but it's super important to use this skill correctly. Like obviously, yeah, if you don't want to port in, then don't use it. But if you do use it correctly, you can do massive plays. Like you can do this and then people are chasing you. Like you can port to the guy in the back of the line and all the guys up here are still chasing you, and you kind of like port behind them. It's just really good. You use that to juke when people like jump off a cliff. You'll put the Shroud 2 on them before you jump off, and then right as they're about to jump off, you port back to them, and then they jump off and you're on top and they're on the bottom. So it's just a really good skill for mobility, getting you into melee range for your Geo procs and your Signet of Vampirism as well procs. So it's just really good for getting you into melee. And you also have Shroud 3. It's just a 1200 range 4-second fear. So 4 seconds of fear is pretty strong because you've got quickness while they're feared. So you're gonna hit them for up to like 3 to 4 like burning while they're feared. So that's gonna do a lot of damage. And fear can also be used sort of strategically because it's not a Reaper fear where you chill them when they're feared. So you can actually control their positioning when you fear them. So how fear works is the target will move away from you directly in a line. So say I fear this guy right here. He will face this way and move this way. If I end up while he's feared moving this way, then he'll end up moving that way. So you can sort of like control your enemy's positioning by fearing them, and you can like send people off of cliffs and get them killed by fall damage, or just literally peel for yourself by getting them away from you. Or you can use it sort of like aggressively, like you can use your Shroud 2 to get into melee range and then fear them, and then kind of like your team is over here and you fear them into your team. So it can be used a lot of ways to, you know, get kills as well as peel for yourself. And then Shroud 4, not too good of a skill because you don't really have a lot of power damage, but it is really good for giving you more life force. So it's a pretty wide AoE, and it just gives you life force for each target you hit. And yeah, it's just kind of nice for kiting because you don't need to be facing the target. So yeah, it's pretty good. Tainted Shackles, though, is probably where most of your damage comes from in Shroud. So Shroud 5 is, it's basically an AoE shackle, and whoever you shackle, it'll deal 8 torment over time when all of them hit, all the pulses, if they don't break the shackle. And then the last pulse will give Immobilize and do a little bit of damage. But it also gives a 5-second reveal, so this build is really strong versus Thieves. Thieves are basically paper to this build. So most Necromancers are used to like Thieves +1ing them and then they die. The tables are turned with this build. So yeah, Core Necro is really good versus Thieves. And also, the Torment is 17-second duration, so it does a lot of damage if you don't cleanse it. So yeah, that's pretty much all the Shroud and weapon skills. Let's talk about Signet of Vampirism. So we already kind of went over this a lot, but yeah, you mainly want to be in melee range to get the healing from it. When you use the cast, it will give you a small heal, so you kind of do want to use it whenever you're out of Shroud, just for a little bit of heal. You don't necessarily need to hit a target with it, you can just cast it randomly, and then you want to go in Shroud and get that cooldown reduction ticking. So yeah, you pretty much just use it before going in Shroud if you got nothing better to do. But if you're going to tank a lot of damage to delay your Shroud a lot more just to use Signet of Vampirism, then you might as well just not use it. So next you have Signet of Undeath. So the passive we already went over, but the active is you'll basically sacrifice 9,000 health, and if it gets interrupted, you still lose that health. So like that, I stow the weapon, I still lost that amount of health. But what it'll do is it'll revive an ally in the area that you use it on. So it's really strong for supporting people. Obviously this is a very selfish build, but you can sort of like use the selfishness of the build to help your allies, because the sacrificing of your health is not that big of a deal because you're really tanky. So say you sacrifice that health, then you just go in Shroud. So it doesn't really matter that you wasted all that health if your teammates are actually useful to you, because you'll get them up and they'll be helping you while you're kind of sustaining and tanking. And then obviously because of Signets of Suffering, that res utility is a very low cooldown. So like right now, I've been in Shroud for maybe 15 seconds. It's up. It's already up. So if my ally goes down again, I actually don't even have enough health to keep resing them. So I just gotta go in Shroud here like that and just try to sustain as much as I can so that I can actually use my heal more. And yeah, if no one's really pressuring me, I'd be able to lifesteal enough to be able to keep resing people. And then yeah, I should have stayed in longer to get it more, but yeah, basically it's a good res utility, and the cost of it is kind of bypassed by the insane survivability of this build, so it's really nice. Next you have Summon Fleshworm. So Summon Fleshworm is pretty interesting and high skill cap skill. It's basically you summon a minion at a location 1,200 feet away, and then if you cast it again, you will be ported 1200 range towards the actual minion. So if I'm right here and I cast it, it'll put me 1200 range towards the flesh worm, not actually on top of it. So there's a limit to the amount of distance you can go, and it's important to know and be very anal about your positioning when you're using the flesh worm. So like if the flesh worm is here and I'm standing down in this pit area, there's really no valid path to get to me. But if I go over to this cliff right here, say for example I put my flesh worm on top of this cliff, right, in preparation to use it, and then I'm like over here, if I use flesh worm right now, I'm going to be at the bottom of the cliff. So I need to make sure I'm in range so that it ports me to the flesh golem and I don't, die to using one of my escape cooldowns, and then the ally or the enemies are still on top of me afterwards. So it allows you to really create distance between your pursuers, and you can also do some cool plays with it, which you'll see later. Next is Spectral Walk. Spectral Walk is a stun break, just like Flesh Worm, but it also cleanses a condition every 2 seconds with Antitoxin. That's 2 conditions every 2 seconds. So really good Conde Cleanse with this, and really good mobility, because how it works is not the same as the Summon Flesh Worm. So it is very overpowered in terms of it has no limit to how it can port you. So whenever you use Spectral Walk, creates a sort of trail behind you, and you will always, when you use it the second time, port back to the original location. So what you can do is, like, someone's chasing you on top of this cliff, then you can use Spectral Walk, come down here, and if they want to chase you, then you can port back up, and now they're down here and you're up there. And if you're being chased by multiple people, for example, like one guy stays up here because he knows you're going to Spectral Walk back, and then the rest chase you down, you can decide, well, who's more dangerous, the one guy up here or the guys chasing me down here? If the guys waiting at your original location are more dangerous, then you can just continue, and you basically split their team and shrugged off a lot of the pressure you're taking just by simply using the skill, because they're trying to counterplay it. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can do with Spectral Walk and like jukes, and especially combined with Flesh Worm, you can do a lot of cool stuff. So like say you do Flesh Worm and then you do your Spectral Walk and then you port. My trail is over here still, so if they follow me after that, then I can Spectral Walk back, and it just complicates trying to chase me. And yeah, it's just really good skills for disengage. But if you're being chased by a Zerg, that's generally not enough to get them off your tail. So the final skill that you have is a Norn Racial. This is why this is not just a build guide, but a race guide. You must re-roll Norn to play this build, because yeah, while Plaguelands is a pretty good skill, it's really not necessary, and there's not many situations that you'll actually get value off of it. So basically what Become the Snow Leopard does is you become basically a snow leopard, and there's a small aftercast once you get into the form, which you have to be careful with, but basically there's only 2 skills you want to be using in the form, the 4 and the 5. The 4 is a charge that you want to hold down, because if you let go of it you won't charge as far, so you gotta hold it down to get the maximum distance, and it allows you to basically disengage really hard. And the 5 skill is a no animation stealth for 5 seconds, and you can use these 2 to basically get out of almost any situation. So it's just a really strong disengage tool, because at the end of the day, if you've got a Zerg on your tail, porting around isn't going to save you if you only do it like once or twice. You're not a thief at mobility, so you're gonna die pretty much. But if you stealth and have a really long distance charge, yeah, you can get out of the situation very, very often. It is a really long cooldown, but if you combine it with Spectral Walk or Fleshworm, it's pretty much a guaranteed disengage, and it kind of makes roaming as a Necromancer feel pretty good, because dying is not really fun, because you have to run back, and it just makes you feel like you had no kind of like freedom, and like it makes you feel like determinism is real whenever you get into those like 1v Zerg fights, because there's nothing you can do. So having the ability to disengage and survive fights makes roaming feel a lot better. So yeah, it's really important. So what you do is you go in, maybe you'll like precast your worm, right? You worm and then immediately go in, press the 5 skill, and then you can use the 4 and hold it down, and there's a 30-second duration on it, so you can generally use the stealth 3 times and maybe the rush twice. And yeah, the stealth is just really good because it lasts 5 seconds. And it's also, what's interesting is the stealth has like a unique buff to it, so you can actually use it while mounted. So like here, I'm out of combat, I get into mount, I'm actually stealthed right now, so I'm stealth mounted. So that's really good. And you can also do some weird stuff where you like go into stealth and then you can like leave the form, and then you can do like a stealth stomp as Necro. So it's just really a strong skill. And oftentimes, yeah, you can get caught without the skill up, and that means you're like dead, but you can kind of like survive long enough to get the skill off cooldown. So even though it's a really long skill and it's balanced, even though it's racial, the fact that the build itself is so ridiculous kind of makes up for it. So yeah, that's pretty much the build. There are some variations that you can use on this build. So pretty much all your utilities here are mandatory, except you can take Plague Lands, and you can trade Summon Fleshworm for a couple other utilities. So you can take Spectral Armor if you want more protection and Life Force gain. This is probably the highest Life Force gain skill in the game, so it just makes you tankier. But at the end of the day, if you need that much tankiness, you probably need the full disengage from the worm. And it's also good to have protection because of Dark Defiance, gives you more Kundi damage reduction, so that's good. You can also take Spectral Ring, which will also give you protection, a little bit less, but it also gives you a Fear, which will give you Life Force because of Fear of Death, but obviously a lot less Life Force than Spectral Armor. So you can take those two. You can also go for Plague Signet. So Plague Signet is really good for like team play, because when you're in Shroud, it actually transfers 2 conditions from nearby allies to yourself, and it allows you to become useful to your team even though you're this really tanky build, because you're transferring all those conditions from your allies to yourself, and then you're cleansing them yourself. So it's sort of like your garbage disposal, and yeah, you're just using your tankiness to survive long enough to eat all of your teammates' condies. And if you have too many condies on you, you can just leave and use Plague Signet and transfer them to a single target, and that'll give you sort of like a burst ability, and you can just go back into Shroud and get the cooldown off. So you can use that quite often for kind of like damage. But yeah, that's pretty much it.